Well, thanks, Alex, for joining us then today. I really appreciate you spending the time just to chat to me about yourself and your ministry and just what you're all about. So thanks for coming on and agreeing to have a chat.
Josh. No worries. It's good to be here.
So is there any way that you would describe yourself for someone who doesn't know you? Is there any sort of snappy catchphrase you could sum up your life as?
My name's Alex Atwell, and I'm from 5 Mile Town in County Tyrone. I'm living in Enniskillen now. But I suppose, I don't know if there's something special about me or anything, but I'm 29 and I've been working with Youth with a Mission, which is a kind of an international Christian movement.
And these places are all Northern Ireland for anyone that's never heard of them before, if anyone international is listening.
That small part of the world that a lot of people might not even have heard of, Everyone knows of Ireland, but Northern Ireland's got its own special, unique kind of story.
There's a million conversations you could have about that topic and its own, right? Just Northern Ireland and its relation to Ireland and the UK. We're kind of the same and different, all that kind of neck of the woods. So, but have you been based here then your whole life really, or have you kind of like moved around the place and traveled, or?
Yeah, like I suppose I grew up here. And my parents are both from here, and I never really left very much, especially growing up, until I was about 19. I left school, and then I went mad traveling. So I started off doing a gap year, I was in Australia for 3 months doing like a discipleship school, and then I went to Mexico for 3 months, and that kind of started off my journey into working with YWAM, and since then I've been to many different nations, spent probably a few months every year. I've been outside of Northern Ireland, although I've kind of mostly been based here.
So your travels then, you'd say, are kind of in relation to your calling and your ministry then, and your kind of missional work that you do, or was there any reason that you kind of wanted to travel other than that, or was it like a calling that you felt that that you had to get involved in?
Yeah, like I suppose I grew up in a Presbyterian church, and just like a rural small congregation, I suppose when I was at school, I was sort of like journeying in my faith and kind of questioning things, and I got involved with this group called Youth for Christ, and I started to maybe branch out of, like, instead of maybe just being around like Presbyterian Christians, I would be interacting with young people and leaders from other kind of denominations, and that probably expanded my kind of horizons. And I suppose in the church I grew up in, were quite reserved, and probably kind of safe and sound. Presbyterians tend to try to not be too like crazy about anything. But I suppose I kind of had a hunger for really going further with God, and I'd sort of started to, through Youth for Christ, and especially there was an event called Manifest. I used to just be encountering God in a different way, and maybe just starting to experience God, starting to read books that like I remember reading Keith Green's book about his life story, and just crying just reading his book and just some of the things he had
For anyone
done.
that doesn't know, including me, about Keith Green, like what was his perspective, or what happened in his life?
Well, he kind of would have kind of probably came to faith during the kind of hippie movement in America, and he was a musician, and he had like different sort of supernatural experiences that kind of like reminded you of the Book of Acts, and I remember just when I was reading the book, I was like really hungry. I was like, whoa, like these things actually are still happening today, and I had not really experience those things in church, but I
Mm.
started to kind of experience those kinds of things. I remember there was one time I was on a bus to Dublin to go to a concert, and I was with a friend, and I was kind of talking to him about my faith, and I we were just very quietly talking, and this lady a few seats up from us just suddenly gets out of her seat and starts screaming at me and swearing at me, and she started shouting, "You've come on this bus to torment me," and it just seemed like such a manifestation, and
And this was on the
I
way to
was
Dublin, did you say?
yeah, I was just on the bus from Ballyshannon to Dublin, and the bus driver actually stopped the bus and came up to see what
Wow.
was going on. And this lady couldn't have physically heard our conversation, but
Yeah.
something in the spirit really triggered her, and she
Wow.
started to really verbally attack us. And things like that just really made me see that there was more to this world than just the
Mm.
natural and more than just what we see with our eyes. And that kind of
How did
had
that
come,
kind of play out in the end? Like how did that situation end up going?
well, different people in the bus just tried to speak calmly to her and say that these guys had done nothing to provoke. And the bus driver made her sit at the front of the bus and
Mm-hmm.
just kind of keep her separately. And I remember we went to the concert. It was a Bob Dylan concert, and I remember we were waiting for the bus on the way home, and we saw the same lady, and she walked past us again, and she just looked at us and recognized us, and she looked really kind of scared or sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really at that moment really recognized that it wasn't
Yeah,
her,
there's
it
definitely something
wasn't her
spiritual
that
involved in that.
had like said those things. It was a spiritual entity.
Wow.
And I suppose, like I'd read in the Bible about, angels and demons and, you know, the Holy Spirit. And I suppose that kind of given me a hunger to really go deeper with God and yeah, experience Him.
I guess it takes experiences like that for it all to sink in really and to like become real. Like you kind of need to see these things tangibly playing out before you realize like there's things in the book like in the Bible that sound like stories, but then I guess when you see them play out, then it brings a whole new perspective on what actually is possible within the world, if you know what I mean. Like you kind of think it sounds like a completely separate storyline almost like so long ago, almost like a long time ago in a galaxy far away, and then as soon as you experience things like that, I guess then it brings it all home that all this is very real.
Yeah, like I think you learn as much through experience as through information.
Mm-hmm.
Like we can all read and we can all, hear things, but it's really the experiences that we have that shape us. And because you can never argue with someone's experience or testimony.
Yeah.
And I think probably over the last 10 years since I did my DTS, um, and even before that, it's probably been experiences that have shaped me. And then the information you're hearing and the teachings and the books you're reading are kind of like, you know, putting the language to that. But
Mm-hmm.
you're really shaped by experiences.
So you mentioned there your DTS. So this is, I guess, fast forward a few years from these kind of early experiences then, or when did you start to get involved? At DTS, really, that's to do with YWAM. Maybe you can explain more about like what that is and maybe what caused you to look into that more. Because I
Yeah,
guess
so
you're sort of, from my experience, like a bit of a minority in your own country with the YWAMers that I know. Like for anyone that doesn't know, YWAM as an organization is all over the world, and you'll obviously explain more about what they're about. But I guess they're based all over the place. And from my experience, like I don't remember, at least when I first started like visiting YWAM bases and meeting people, you were almost like a minority along with a few other people that were actually from Northern Ireland, based in
yeah,
Northern Ireland.
yeah, that's right. And you'll whenever you go to a YWAM base, you'll normally meet people from many different countries. And I suppose I kind of heard about it through a school friend, and his sister had went to Australia and did a DTS, so I kind of just followed in her footsteps. And a DTS is a discipleship training school, so it's all kind of about knowing God, and that kind of comes in three parts. There's knowing God, like himself, like your relationship with God, but also knowing yourself, and knowing the world. So it's like you've a relationship with God, but you've also a relationship with yourself, and you have a relationship with the world. And I suppose the teachings you're hearing are kind of in those categories of like, how do we relate to God? Like, what does that look like? And how do we relate to ourselves, like in terms of our own personal development and growth? And then what does it look like to relate to the world as a believer? How should we see things through God's eyes? So yeah, like
So
it's
what
pretty
kind of made
cool.
YWAM jump out to you? I suppose like there's a lot of organizations doing training, like I guess there's the Bible College and there's things like that. So what exactly, so for start, like what is YWAM and what is it about YWAM that really appealed to you over other organizations?
Um, I didn't really look that much into what to do. I suppose I was looking at doing a gap year, and I was sort of open for options.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked the idea of getting out of Northern Ireland and traveling. So that was probably definitely a part of the appeal. I didn't know a lot about YWAM before I actually went. Um, but I just heard like a lot of good reports
Mm-hmm.
from different friends who'd done it.
That stands for Youth with a Mission, right? Doesn't that?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
youth with a mission, and the kind of slogan would be to know God and make Him known. So the idea of like being taught, but also then going and like telling others what you've learned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so you were introduced, or you kind of coincidentally then, I guess, came across YWAM and DTSs. Really, it was through friends, did you say there? And then,
Mhm.
so they recommend that you go and do this. And then I guess, how did you first sort of reach out, and like, what were your first experiences like? Maybe did you know what you were getting into when you first, like, I guess, turned up on the first day?
Um, Not really. Like I was young, I was 19 and hadn't spent more than like 10 days outside of Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I suppose it was quite adventurous. Just I remember, going to Perth and just, it was minus 10 degrees in Northern Ireland when I left. It was like January the 1st, and then arrived in Perth is 40 degrees. So that's like 50 degrees of
Yeah.
a jump. And
I
I
guess it was
remember,
like our winter, their summer, then, like that kind of
yeah,
scenario.
that's right. And I said hello to these couple of Canadians, and I tried to talk to them, but they couldn't understand me. They didn't understand my accent. And then I met an English fella, and then we started chatting because he could understand me better.
Yeah.
But
Translate.
yeah, and I remember, I think the third night we just were sitting in small groups and just telling our stories, like who we were, and you know and I while I was telling my story, I started crying. Like I would
Mm.
just, and I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't finish my story.
And would
you
that have
know
been like a common thing for someone who knows you to see you crying,
no,
or?
not at all, not at all. Like I maybe hadn't cried for years, and I couldn't. It was like something was happening in me. It was like
Mm-hmm.
it was some kind of like
A deeply spiritual
thing in my heart
experience?
that
Yeah.
was, yeah, there was something open up in my heart. And I was just ready to receive all that I could learn.
Mm.
And we went on our outreach to Mexico City, and
Wow, that's
yeah,
a good journey there.
yeah, like it was a crazy journey. We flew from Perth to Brisbane, Los Angeles, Phoenix, and then Mexico City. So I think it
Wow.
was like 40 hours of traveling, but it again just so different, to Northern Ireland. Like it's one of the biggest cities in the world, Spanish speaking, food is very different, and I
Yeah.
come from like Northern Ireland, and it was just a
Potatoes and
really,
meat we're raised on. No spices or anything like that around our food.
no, like everything was just a new experience. And I really fell in love with Mexico City, and just had great times there that, you know, will never leave me, you know.
And have you been back there since your kind of outreach time?
I have, yeah. I've been back a number of times actually, and I've stayed in contact with some of the folks we worked with, and I've been able to like really see like the continuation, like almost the legacy of what our team was a part of there. And then
Yeah,
now
I
I
guess you
have
hear like a lot of people will go on these missions trips, I guess, like almost like a couple of months in the summer when they're like 17, and then you go there for maybe a week or two, and then you never go back, or you never get to see the future of that place. And I guess it must be really cool to see kind of the small amount of time. I guess it's a couple of months, isn't it, that you were there?
yeah
But even
3 months.
still, like I guess a small amount of time in the grand scheme of things, but that the impact that that small amount of time, that small investment had in the people there. I'm
Yeah,
sure that like must have been a cool experience for sure.
yeah. Like I think there's a lot to be said for going back places and, you know, having a long-term mindset, um, because, you know, otherwise, you know, it can become like just a tourism mentality. And, you know, I think it's important to really to invest and to really to love the people and the places you go to. Sometimes the biggest work that needs done is in our own hearts, and just in our own perspectives, and just really like learning about this world that we live in. um,
Yeah.
you know, and of course you try to, you know, serve and do your bit, but I think listening and um, seeing and experiencing is really an important thing for us to do, especially, you know, for young people,
Yeah.
like when you're 18, 19, and, you know, you don't know very much.
And how much did that experience, I guess, like broaden your horizons? Like, did you come home completely changed, or did you come home like with perspective, or how would you say that like shifted from like you as a 19-year-old or whatever that hadn't really traveled anywhere? Like, how what would the difference be like in the person that returned to
Well, I think
Fermanagh
it opened
or
my
Tyrone?
eyes. Like it really opened my eyes to what was out there, and it probably ruined me in a sense for like the ordinary. There's that phrase, ruined for the ordinary. Um, like I found a passion that I hadn't really had before. You know, a passion for life, a passion for God, and passion for the world. That really me beforehand, I'd never had that. You know, I was quite a like closed up guy, and um, I was probably a bit like melancholic and down, and, you know, it kind of probably took myself too seriously in many
Yeah.
ways. But I think this sort of experience through DTS really helped me experience joy and passion and
Wow.
purpose.
Yeah. And is there like, I'm sure you have plenty of stories to tell from your DTS, but is there like any moment, I guess, or one story or a main thing that, like you said, some things will never leave you and the experience will never leave you, but is there anything that really like hit home to your core, maybe more than anything else, or even anything you saw that like really shook you, would you say?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, like I would say like there's probably several things. Um, but I suppose like the whole experience of just being in a team with people from other countries and other cultures and other church backgrounds and beliefs, you know, and, you know, working through conflict with each other.
I was just about to ask, was there conflict in
Yeah, like
with so many
there's
different cultures?
always conflict, and it can be a really good thing, you know,
Hmm.
because I think really we learn through conflict.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, we like conflict is often it's a conflict between who we are and what we know, and then the new information that we're learning, or the new, you know, people we're experiencing. So
Yeah.
yeah, like I don't know it, you know, I remember just in Mexico, and even just the churches in Mexico, just they had a whole different way of operating. Like I was used to maybe 1 hour sharp like service, whereas we would go to a church in Mexico and it maybe went for 7 hours, and we would like be worshiping and praying, and there would be a much longer kind of thing and prophesying over us, and just getting like words from God that really meant something, and seeing people just being filled with the Holy Spirit, and that kind of thing were just really powerful.
In terms of your experience at YWAM, then, what would you say? Was there like an overriding aim that YWAM or almost like a philosophy of the organization? Would you say, or is just kind of like a broad-based Christian learning, or would you say like does it teach in particular areas? Because I know there's some places maybe specialize in certain areas of our faith. Would you say that there was anything like that in terms of YWAM, or do they have like a view of a certain slant on things?
Like I think YWAM is quite broad, and diverse, because we're international, we're interdenominational, but it's also broad structured and decentralized. So, each kind of YWAM base kind of develops its own kind of focus. And for the last 6 years, I've been in Rostrevor in Northern Ireland, and the focus there has been about peace and reconciliation. And a lot of the work that's been done there and the things that I've been learning has been to do with reconciling with people groups that have conflict or have gone through conflict. So like here in Northern Ireland, with the situation between the British and the Irish, but also, places like South Africa. I spent a couple of outreaches where I went there, and just in the backdrop of, apartheid and things like that between the blacks and the whites, and being in Lebanon, where there's been many kind of factions and different political groups that have been at war, and even Israel was at war with Lebanon. And so in terms of a focus for YWAM in Northern Ireland, it is to do with that kind of post-conflict and healing the wounds of war.
And I guess for anyone that maybe is not as well learned or researched about the situation in Northern Ireland, do you want to give like a brief overview of maybe why Northern Ireland would be the perfect place for a centre of peace and reconciliation, conflict resolution? Do you want to even like go in a little bit maybe of how you guys heal the divisions, and maybe what those divisions are and what you kind of see from people in Northern Ireland, in your home country?
Yeah, it is a complicated history, but it's probably at least 400 years old. So about 400 years ago, Britain sent people over to live in the northern part of Ireland, and those people were Scottish and English settlers, and they were Protestants, and whereas the local Irish people were Catholics. And so there's been many kind of like conflicts throughout the centuries, but more recently, in the last 100 years, Northern Ireland was created, and
it was all Ireland within the UK before that, I guess.
Yeah. So basically, Ireland gained independence from the UK, from the British kind of Empire, and then Northern Ireland remained in that, and because the population of Northern Protestants that desired to stay, Northern Ireland ended up being like a Protestant kind of run country,
like an enclave.
But around maybe 50-40% of the population were still Irish Catholics, and they felt discriminated against, and there was a civil rights movement, and it kind of got taken over by the IRA, which was an extremist kind of militant group, and that created the Troubles, which was like a 30-year conflict between Irish Republicans who were fighting for a united Ireland, and then the British state, who were kind of trying to keep hold of their territory in Ireland. So the
Yeah.
British Army and the police security forces and even loyalist paramilitaries, who were
I
more
guess
loyal.
there's so many slants on and views on it. You know, some people will say the British, for example, were trying to peacefully guarantee the rights of the citizens to live without fear of terrorism, and then on the whole other side of the community will see them as furthering an agenda in order to kind of suppress, you know, and discriminate, and you know they were almost agents of a British state that were oppressors, and you know, from that sort of colonial British background, and then on the other side, you know, you could say the IRA brutally, you know, slaughtered innocent people, and then others will say the IRA were really formed from the exhaustion of the Catholic population, to, you know, that they couldn't go any further with the political process perhaps, and then maybe they felt this was the way to violently fight back and to resist through those means. But there's so many different views, and I guess that's how it's, or why there is a need for reconciliation in this part of the world. And would you say that you saw like a lot of, or you met people with a lot of those experiences of hurt and pain from the past in your time at YWAM?
Yeah, like I think there's, you know, everyone has their own story, and I think I grew up like quite Protestant, you know, in a Protestant British community. So that's one of the things about Northern Ireland, is that people tend to grow up like in one side or the other, because often our communities are separated from each other.
It's getting better, but on the whole, yeah.
Yeah. And whereas when I moved to Rostrevor, it was basically crossing the divide. So Rostrevor was much more Irish Catholic community. And I think it was really healthy for me to like kind of live in that world for a while, because I think I didn't, and I think none of us realized how kind of shaped we are by, you know, the kind of worldview that we grew up with. And it's only really when we kind of come into contact with the other and with different worldviews that we can maybe see that it's not always as simple as how we thought it was. Or
so it would be fair to say, like, your view of the world, even in terms, I know you'd been abroad, but in terms of your own home country, your view of your own country was challenged then from your time there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, obviously, you know, I'm still me, and I'm still, you know, I'm still who I was growing up, but I've probably learned a lot more, and learned, like, it shaped my own view of, you know, faith and politics. And it's, you know, probably a lot of the teachings that I like received in Rostrevor were things that I maybe had never considered before, or yeah, just growing in that kind of whole theology of peacemaking. Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, like you said, that the focus of that area is or of that base is peace and reconciliation. And you said that I guess coming into contact with people from opposing views and hearing these different different interpretations of your faith and theology that you may not have heard before, like what kind of ways would you see that sort of translating into your views? Like, for example, how did that change your view of perhaps, you know, being from a Protestant British background? Like, you know, you probably were inclined to be supportive of Britain and to feel like a sense of that being your country and being proud of that. Would you say that your view of that sort of thing changed, and maybe how you saw even your own side of the fence, as they would say?
Yeah, like there's probably a lot to say about that. I think probably one of the things that's helped me has really been trying to like discern what is, you know, what is Christianity, or what is like the gospel. and what is like culture. You know, and like,
It's a big
so
question.
some of the things we grow up with are culture, and maybe not as kind of central to the gospel as, you know, the important things. So I think even just in terms of Russ Trevor, but also in terms of going to focus nations, um, where there has been conflict and war, has really helped me to try to think of those difficult questions, and um, try to sort of work out my salvation in a sense, you know, and um, not just like having intellectual beliefs that are, you know, right,
Mm-hmm.
but, you know, living and following the way of Christ, and, you know, that, you know, it somehow has to go from, you know, these kind of beliefs that we hold to our hearts and to how we live and how we interact with others.
Would you say there was views that you would have had, or maybe from your culture, your side of the community, that you recognized as perhaps being toxic and that you needed to maybe to reevaluate? You know, would you say there's that process happened of evaluating your whole sort of
Yeah,
cultural outlook?
yeah, like, I think, you know, Northern Ireland has a lot of, you know, maybe toxic environments or atmospheres, and like sectarianism, for example, would be one that, you know, we're all familiar with, and that, you know, sectarianism is basically, um, you know, maybe hating another person or because of their religious beliefs, or because of, you know, for a Protestant it might be like, I hate Catholics, you know,
Mm-hmm.
or, you know, but
Yeah.
sectarianism can come out in many different ways, and I think I would have definitely been challenged. You know, probably one of the views that it's quite common in some circles, in Protestant circles, would be to view the Catholic Church as really, you know, like really bad and really, you know, wrong, and, you know, it's
Mm-hmm.
so many problems and um, so many things that are just wrong about the Catholic Church. Like, that was kind of my
Mm-hmm.
mentality. Um,
And did
but most of those views are, you know, Protestant views. So I like,
yeah.
where did I learn those views? Well, from other Protestants who didn't like the Catholic Church. But whenever you start to hear Catholics talking about, you know, the Catholic Church, and, you know, maybe meeting other Christians who are Catholics and who maybe grew up on the other side, it
Mm-hmm.
kind of breaks down those, some of those like stereotypes, or some of those myths, I guess.
I guess my question would be then, if, for example, you have theological disagreements, perhaps, or like ways or things that you disagree with, perhaps, about Catholicism, and maybe things you think are harmful about the way some of the ways they practice. Like, would you say then do you find it hard, or would you avoid that sort of criticism really, or how would you go about maybe saying or discipling someone through perhaps things that they'd picked up that were harmful, I guess, without being inflammatory? You know, because I think in the past, I would say rightfully there were people in Northern Ireland, especially Protestants, that picked out um, views on the other side and really rallied against them. So, for example, I think nearly all denominations have something that you could find a flaw or a fault with, you know, and
Yeah.
but it was, I guess, the way that manifested in terms of going out in public and shouting about how the Pope is sent by the devil. And I guess there's ways. How would you approach those kind of differences without being inflammatory, or would you kind of avoid really that whole area
Um,
altogether?
well, no, I don't think it's good to avoid it at all. Like, I would think it's definitely good to speak into those areas. Um, and I'm just thinking about one of the things that Jesus talked about, was, you know, removing the plank from your own eye before you,
Mm.
you know, try to talk about the speck in your brother's eye. Um, and that whole idea of self-reflection, um, kind of owning, you know, our own problems and our own
Yeah.
mistakes before we kind of project our problems about other groups. So like I think it takes a long journey of humility, because really I think a lot of times in conflicts and in Northern Ireland there's a pride, and there's like pride kind of, when you walk in pride you can't really see your own faults, and
Yeah, and it's the pride in being right in your eyes, I guess.
yeah, there's a self-righteousness there, like, and a blindness, and Jesus used to, really lay into the Pharisees, for that. um, so I think in terms of facing theological differences, I think in general it's good to look inward and to look at our own group and how we portray ourselves and how the other side might see us, how the other side might
Yeah.
have been hurt by us. And
I think
then,
that's really important, especially in areas that have had conflict, to have that moment of evaluation and just studying where we've been hurtful, and we have to own that hurt. And I
yeah,
guess you don't have to abandon your views that you believe are right in order to to own the hurt that's caused in the past from how that was expressed.
that's
And I
right.
guess that's where people
Yeah,
maybe fall into tricky territory, because maybe they're too proud, I guess, to back down, or feel like that they're, like, I know a lot of people that sort of have this attitude of like, why should I really be apologetic for going against what's wrong? And I
hmm,
guess, there's a time and place for that as well, but especially where there's a context of so much hurt, then that's where you get into just that
yeah, yeah,
being tactful, I suppose.
and again comes back to listening and like
Mm-hmm.
really building relationships with people across the divide. Um, because if you don't have those relationships, then you can't have healthy conversations and you can't get to a place of understanding. Um, so it's really just trying to be humble and trying to build those relationships, and learn and see people as humans and as people that want to follow God.
And I guess from your perspective, like I guess learning the lessons from the past, and learning, I guess, the way of peace in a divided society, I guess that has, from my conversations with you, translated, I guess, into a more broad view of being against violence in all forms. And I know there's lots of views, especially within Christianity, on the topic of violence and even pacifism. But would you say then that in that broader context, then that were you always that way inclined, or was it fair to say now that you're anti-violence, or what way would you sort of describe your views on that?
Yeah, I think you're picking up on some of my posts on social media and that kind of
Yeah, and
thing.
I guess I have
Yeah,
to give you credit, because your posts on social media were really how most of this started, because I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a forum for people to discuss the views? And even if I disagree with you on things, which I do, and I'm honest in saying that, there's, I guess, having the forum to be able to talk it out and learn from each other's point of views, I thought was necessary, and also kind of missing in some ways. So
yeah,
there's Facebook posts are great at, well, they're great at a number of things. They're great at you putting across a large volume of your information in kind of one go. And then they're also great for starting arguments instead of discussions.
mhm,
So that's, I guess that's how I originally was maybe intending on some debates, but then I thought maybe a podcast where we can learn from each other's views and just talk about them in a longer format would be really helpful. So
yeah,
I guess, yes, your Facebook posts, and that was really in relation to the military and the war and how. So
yeah. So
do you want to summarize kind of what that was
yeah, like
about?
I think if I read my posts, whenever I was 19, and I probably would not understand, or I would be confused. I'd be like, huh, you know,
Yeah.
um, So, and I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about like learning from experiences, maybe more than information. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right that sometimes when you post things on the internet, it not everyone is going to read it in the same way, or not everyone's maybe ready for that
Yeah.
information, or
And don't get me
they're
wrong, like I wouldn't say that it's like wrong to post like that on Facebook, but
Mhm.
I there's also it's a great tool for helping people to learn, but then it also has its drawbacks as well, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's going to connect with some people more than others, um, yeah, like I suppose one of the posts I was doing recently has been talking about the VE Day,
Mm-hmm.
and um, I was sort of mentioning how so often we can, you know, celebrate military victories in like a kind of nationalistic way, um, and that it's maybe not always as simple as that. And 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 yeah, like I think probably even I've been using music in that way of like
Mm-hmm.
challenging maybe some views that I've grown up with. Um,
I
because
guess
I'm a
this all relates really well to your song. You have a song called Remembrance Sunday, isn't that the name of the song?
yeah, I've got a song about Remembrance Sunday, and I think I've got written a song about the 12th of July as well called Don't Drag God Into the Mix.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there's another song, the Border Walk song, which sort of talks about like, you know, coming together, you know, and surrendering to each other, rather than, you know, kind of like staying behind our walls, in separate communities. So yeah, I've written a number of songs and material over the last few years, and I suppose I think it comes up quite spontaneously. Like maybe maybe I'll, like for example, the song Remembrance Sunday. I remember writing it on Remembrance Sunday because for a few years on Remembrance Sunday, I had this sense of just uneasiness, or
Mm-hmm.
like there's this kind of like
Yeah.
just
Well, I
mulling
know the
through
feeling
things
for sure. Yeah.
and just trying to like process some thoughts in a poem, is kind of a helpful way for me to like describe the uneasiness that I sometimes
Mm-hmm.
have had. Um, and yeah, I don't necessarily expect everybody to get it, you know, to like agree with these perspectives, but I suppose in some ways, whenever some people might be having similar thoughts or similar experiences and can relate to it, and can maybe help them, you know, discern something
Mm-hmm.
that's going on in their walk with God and in their journey. Um,
So I
and
guess how would you summarize like your view of Remembrance Sunday that you portrayed in that song? Like what I guess is it that made you uneasy, or what sort of cultivated that feeling of I'm not sure about this? Like what is it you saw?
yeah, I suppose like yeah, it's a big topic, but I suppose a lot of the kind of things that I've been talking about or singing about comes towards a backdrop of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, in terms of like my my job as a missionary, you know, there it can get a little bit, you know, the lines can be a bit blurry sometimes with, okay, we're supposed to like reach out to people with the gospel of Jesus, you know, and with the love of God. But a lot of times in the past or in some of the countries we were going to, um, you know, it can, there's like there's a history there, you know, and even in the context of Ross Trevor where I was, and like there's a history of you know, British um, people from Britain coming to Ireland and, you know, trying to put something on them, or, you know, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's like their religion or, you know, their political system, or their music, or there's like a cultural kind of clash that happens. And I suppose I've had a journey of like kind of wrestling with how do we bring Jesus without bringing our kind of cultural cultural baggage. So like with, you know, with remembrance and with other things like that, I've been reading, one of my kind of influences would be a guy called Brian Zond.
Mhm.
And he's got this book, A Farewell to Mars. It's actually here. I'll just show you the cover of it here.
Mhm.
Um, and it talks about, like, you know, um, one of the things it talks about is civil religion. So if you think of like colonialism, say for example, Britain back in the day had a global empire, where, you know, Britain was kind of, you know, expanding its territory and basically overpowering, you know, weaker nations.
Mhm.
And yeah, that's obviously something that most people would look at now and think that's bad, you know, it's not good. And but back in the day, you know, what
Yeah, that was, I
people,
guess, the way the world was operated. You know, as in some ways, that was the name of the game in the I guess the 1700s, 1800s, even maybe earlier, and sometimes into the early 1900s. You know, I guess the name of the game was conquest and colonies, and your power, the power of your nation, was measured in its colonial assets and land. You know.
yeah, and especially, you know, European powers like white European nations were, you know, kind of exploiting like Africa and Asia
Mm-hmm.
and the Americas. And unfortunately, Christian theology was a huge part of that. You know, and Harry Smith, who he led the Christian Renewal Center in Rostrevor before it was YWAM. He's
Mm-hmm.
written a great book on the doctrine of discovery,
Okay.
and manifest destiny, and it kind of traces how, you know, Christian theology kind of like gave an okay to emperors to, like, you know, do these things and to like to take
Mm-hmm.
land and to, you know, basically using the Bible to justify colonialism. And one of the things Brian Zahn talks about is civil religion. Um, and he basically talks about how civil religion is kind of a way that the government or the state can have like a spiritual blessing or a spiritual kind of way of um, doing things that kind of gives a kind of religious dimension to
Mm-hmm.
what the state is
Legitimacy, I
doing.
guess.
Yeah, like a legitimacy. Yeah, and the state. So civil religion kind of is like flags, you know,
Mm-hmm.
anthems, monuments, memorials,
And
and kind of
in your perspective now, like from your whole experiences, would you say that those kind of, um, like you said, anthems, icons, imagery, would you say that's a negative overall in today's world, and especially for Christians to take part in? You perhaps pride in a flag, pride in statues of great leaders, and what people would term great leaders. You know, would you say that's a harmful area for Christians to kind of wade into?
in general, yes. Like I think it's like I it's important to maybe distinguish between like the church and the state in a way. Like I don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily expect the state to, you know, behave like in a Christian way or like in the way that the church would behave. But I think what's happened, you know, especially in places like Northern Ireland, is that the kind of there's been a very much a mixing of, you know, cultural, maybe political values, and then Christianity, or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, our version of Christianity. And you know, I think that often maybe muddies the water and kind of it makes it kind of hard for people to read the teachings of Jesus and, you know, actually kind of, you know, relate to it. Like I think because Jesus was actually not trying to um you know, start a country
Yeah.
or you know, he was kind of a countercultural. He started a countercultural movement, whereas maybe, you know, many centuries later, Christians have often ended up doing things and supporting things that are un-Christ-like, but there isn't, because there's lack of understanding of maybe how these things work.
And I guess from my perspective, you know, you could say we disagree on certain areas, but also agree on a lot of things. Like, for example, I remember um, my uncle, um, he he lived in Lurgan, and which is in Northern Ireland as well. He um, went to a church in the middle of the town, and they got a new minister, as the Church of Ireland often do. They kind of assign a minister to a church. I guess it's not really always a process of the church picking its leaders. They kind of tour the country and get assigned to different churches. And I remember this minister came into their church in the center of Lurgan, and he tried to take down the Union flag from either on the top of the church or inside it. And I remember my uncle kind of having stern words with him, where he went up to him and basically said, "You've no right to do this. You know, it's fine. You can go over to whatever church you came from and do that, but you know, while you're in my church, in my country, you'll not take down the flag of this country." And I guess, you know, to me, I never saw particularly an issue with that in terms of the principle of, oh, it's a flag of your country and it's appropriate to have a flag of your country flying in your country. And I guess that isn't a view that I always have. But then the issue, I guess, is where and I guess America has been much better at this than the UK in terms of separation of church and state, but also in different ways they've been worse at it, because you could argue the UK is just as secular, if not more secular, than America. And we have religion almost built into our system, and America doesn't. But in a lot of ways, American religion comes out more in American culture than British culture. So there's I guess there's different ways of expressing it. But I never had an issue myself with seeing my country's flag in my church. But the difficulty there is from the perspective of inclusion and making people feel welcome, and I guess how that flag is what it represents to some people. Like, to me, it represents pride in what, on the face of it, to me, is a good nation, and a nation that is perhaps one to be proud of, regardless of the past. But to a lot of people, all they can see from that is a sort of reverence of things that have happened in the past that weren't good, and they should be frowned upon, and perhaps things that people have done in the name of the country that has hurt them. And then I guess they start to put that together in terms of, well, this faith is backed by people who back things that weren't right, you know. And I guess that's where it starts to get muddy. And I guess that's, from a lot of your perspective, that's where you come from. And I guess we may disagree on the principle of those images, but I definitely agree that things become far more complex when it's all embedded and conjoined, like the way it sometimes is, both in America and in the UK.
Yeah, and I think probably one of the influences that has kind of been there in my life is the whole idea of the kingdom of God, and like, what is the kingdom of God, and you know, like, yeah. So, and how do we build the kingdom of God? And I suppose I would have kind of sort of separated, like, the kingdom of God is not an earthly kingdom, and it's not, you know, heaven is not, you know, the ideal of America or of Britain, or, you know, the kingdom of God is very different from any of the kingdoms of this world. And I think sometimes we can miss some of the beauty of what Jesus is trying to do in this world. If we kind of, like, it's much bigger than, you know, just a nation, or than, you know, trying to, like, build a nation. In a sense, like, there is like a scandalous kind of grace in Christ that we don't find in our nations. And I think maybe Christianity loses out whenever we try to tie it up in, in our flags or,
Mm-hmm.
in our political systems.
What would you say your views are, for example, on, I know on your Facebook post it was brought up, the idea of loyalty to country and to God as two sort of coexisting, I guess you could say, kingdoms, or um like kind of the idea for king and country, and then for also for God and Ulster is another way of putting that. For there's your king and your country, and then there's also the idea of God as well, and you can be loyal to both of those at the same time. And what would you kind of say your opinion is of people who would say, we have a duty and perhaps a right to be loyal to the king, but loyal to God as well, and they're both, that's maybe the way that the Bible would say it should be. Would you agree with that philosophy?
Yeah, like I think, Jesus sort of talks about give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And I think Christians should be like good citizens, and they should, obey the law of the land and that kind of thing. Um, but I do think that um, Christians shouldn't compromise their faith by, following the government and following the state or the land into, you know, things that are anti God and anti Christian.
And I
Like
guess you would include war with that sentiment.
yeah, yeah. Like I would include like violence and war and you know like uh, execution and things like that. I would definitely include in that.
And there's definitely complex issues with a lot of views on them. Like, for example, to me, I would have the perspective that in some cases military action would be justified and would be a just thing to do, and perhaps even condoned by my interpretation of the Bible. But for example, you would have a different view, and I know a lot of my friends and a lot of people we both know, but I share the view of total non-violence and almost restraint. And do you think that both kind of views can coexist in the church, or do you think that, would you say that the view of that the military action can be justified as a harmful one? Because I know of a lot of Christians that maybe feel like as their calling, for example, to get involved in the military. And sort of, how do you think that's a misinterpretation, or do you think it's perhaps like it's a tool of the enemy, perhaps, or do you think that there's room for kind of both of those perspectives in the modern church?
Yeah, I think there's always room for disagreement, and there's always room for ideas. Um, I just like was aware of a quote by there's this guy Medgar Evers who was a civil rights leader in America, and he was killed, but he's quoted as saying, "You can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea." And my kind of view would be that Jesus's ideas, like the things that Jesus taught, like you know those ideas are not going to go away, but they're going to
Mm-hmm.
grow and they're going to fill the earth, and eventually
Yeah.
heaven will be here, like we're
Well, the early
praying.
church kind of exploded, like, I guess
Yeah,
they killed Jesus, and there was only like 12 loyal disciples, I guess, at that stage, or you could say 11. But from the big crowds down to the kind of core, and then the church exploded, really. And, I guess that's the evidence of that.
yeah, like I think the when we're praying for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven, like I think that that's a reality, and that the ideas and the things that Jesus lived out will eventually win the
Mm-hmm.
argument. Like so, and I might my interpretation of what Jesus taught might be different from another person's, but
Mm-hmm.
I think in general the kind of tide of history is becoming more and more like what like the kingdom of God will look like, and I would say like we are more peaceful, we're less violent as a like as a world, you know, now than we used to be. And I think hopefully we will continue to on that pathway.
Yeah, at least on the state sanctioned level, perhaps.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, we've seen in the US, there's violence and it'll always rear its head. But I guess as a societal view, that violence is less. It used to almost be expected just as part and parcel of the world, and that was the way it was. But I guess now we're moving to a stage of, you could say, almost like a post-violence society. But then, like, there's a lot of crazy stuff that does go on, militarily
Yeah.
and things like that.
Like,
But on the whole, I guess the view is changing.
yeah, like I think, even what we're seeing at the moment in America with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's incredible because you've got more and more voices who are agreeing that, you know, for example, in this particular area, Black Lives Matter, and like more voices that I think if you have wars happening now, you'll have more and more people who are protesting war and saying that this is not the answer. And I've got friends who are Christians who've got involved in war, so I'm aware that not everyone agrees with these things, but I think in general, there is, and there has to be more recognition of our colonial past, and coming to terms with that and righting the wrongs of, injustice, whether it's racial injustice or whether it's oppression of, other nations. Um, because I think when we're, seriously seeking to do what's right and seeking God, the past does come up and we have to like really repent and really forgive.
And I guess it brings us back sort of to that post about remembrance. And I guess to me, the kind of question that it brought up in my mind was, I mean, I don't often doubt the intention of Christians who get involved in the military. I think their intention is definitely to do the right thing. I also think it's possible for some of the conflicts they've been involved in to be either wrong or misguided in their in the way they were thought out, or perhaps the wisdom of them. But then I guess the question of a just war is one that's interesting, especially with the amount of reverence, especially with the world wars, particularly the Second World War, but also the first as well. And in your mind, how do you view that kind of question of, were some wars just? Like, was the Second World War, for example, a good time to go to war, but was the first a bad time, or was that wrong, or were both of them wrong, or how would you? What's your view on that kind of idea of some wars being just?
Yeah, I think like there's this like Brian Zand. There's a quote he gave one time, and he said, "Just war is just war." Like just war ends up being just war. You know what I mean? So it's like,
Yeah,
we might call a war just, but the result is still people killing each other. So it's not like if a war is just or not that it makes it nicer or somehow.
yeah, that definitely doesn't make it any nicer. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think like humanity has a long history, of war and violence and people killing each other, and I think Jesus was someone who presented a new way, like a new way to be human, and I think if we, follow the way of Jesus, that will eventually lead to peace, and that his kingdom will be a kingdom of peace. So it's it's complicated when you start looking at specific wars and situations and how the world has developed in terms of modern warfare and that kind of thing. But yeah, I would say that as Christians we should be always working towards forgiveness and peacemaking and like building an industry of you know resolving conflicts and being peacemakers and rather than being part of war machines and building an industry of a cycle of violence and a cycle of revenge.
Yeah, and I definitely, like, my view would be absolutely that Christians should um endeavor with everything they have to avoid war. I don't know if I'd necessarily go as far as saying that some wars or war can never be justified, because I do think the concept of a defensive war, I guess you could include the Second World War in that. And I think a lot of wars have a lot of different strands to them and um, different ways that they or different people have different motivations for going to war, a lot of which that we don't even know that are going on. But I think the concept perhaps of like, especially with the Nazis, I think that was something that to me seemed right to rise up against. And I know that some of the comments on your Facebook were portraying that view as well, that the idea that Christianity would be so passive as to see the greatest evil potentially that the world has ever seen, and to take a kind of backseat view, or like to kind of to say, well, we're not getting involved in that, and not to say that aren't other ways of getting involved in resisting that, but I guess the biggest way would be resistance with force. So for me, like, I wonder, I mean, I guess it comes down to my opinions of what would Jesus do, and I think that um Jesus obviously and God being the same being, like, there's been a lot of examples of what could be described as a war that wars that God condones throughout the Old Testament. And I guess to realize that Jesus was in that, making those decisions as well, shows that there may be like a justification in some senses of violence being something that God could condone in the right circumstances. But it's a very difficult subject, I think, or a very difficult decision for each Christian to make, really, as to how far they're willing to go with that. And for me, definitely, if you look at a terrible evil, that should be resisted. But then, really, if a country, for example, is going to go to war for oil and to profit the sort of corporations that want to run pipelines through countries or whatever, but really, if you're too ignorant to see that that's what's going on, and I'm not saying about any war in particular, but I know that's the way wars could go in the future. For example, that could be something that could happen. I think that level of ignorance is something that couldn't be tolerated from Christianity, but I guess it's a personal decision, really, as to how far or what you're willing to condone, and it's down to your interpretation of the Bible, like you said. But I definitely agree in what you said in terms of, like, Christianity as a community really should be as opposed to wars, especially needlessly, as possible.
Yeah, and I think the question of the Bible is crucial in this. And like, does God condone violence? In the Old Testament, and there's a guy, Greg Boyd, who's got a really good teachings on that. And probably, you know, probably the way you look at Scripture is a huge part of, how do you understand the nature of God and the nature of, how God works through history. There's like loads of like theological kind of implications that kind of need to sort of fall into place on either side of the
Absolutely.
argument.
Absolutely. You mentioned about your music, and I guess just as a final topic of conversation, so you're a musician. You write what I would probably describe as provocative music, perhaps even controversial at times. Is that? Do you want to even talk about, like, your influences in that, and maybe is that the way you seek to be seen, or what are your motivations, perhaps? So just talk, if you want to talk a little bit about what you do and what kind of music you write.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, like, I suppose I don't necessarily try to write a type of music. I guess it just, whatever comes out. Like, so, some of my songs are more like protest songs, or like songs with like a real kind of message. And some of them are more like love songs, or just like if I've gone through some kind of thing in my life, or you know um
Yeah.
and Bob Dylan would be a big influence in that. And yeah, I suppose his early kind of material in the 60s, I've kind of, yeah, saw how, he really could speak out about social issues, um, and yeah, it really, I think it does change people's lives and change people's perspectives, and like songs and music kind of can really get to people's hearts maybe in a way that other things can't. Um, and
Hmm.
yeah,
When
I've
did you first sort of realize that being a musician is something that you could do, or were you always kind of musically inclined?
um, I think probably only in the last couple of years have I really started to use it the way I maybe would like. It was always maybe a bit of a hobby
Hmm.
and something that I did on the side, but probably the Border Walk song was the first song that I could really see actually this being useful, in
Hmm.
some way. Um, I remember in Rush Driver, I was able to play the Boardwalk song at Fiddler's Green Festival, and there was a Tommy Sands who's like an Irish peace activist and a singer songwriter. He has this event called the Music of Healing, and he asked me to play the Boardwalk song at it.
Hmm.
Um, and as a kind of Protestant British Northern Irish person, to be able to sing a song of healing and reconciliation to like a room full of Irish Catholics
Hmm.
mostly, and they really warmly received the song, and I realized then it was like, wow, like actually music really has the power to bring people together, and it has the power to challenge, you know, maybe some toxic views, or to kind of speak out against things that needs people to speak out against.
And is that process to you like a spiritual process, would you say, the process of songwriting, or is it your way maybe of processing things that you're wrestling with yourself, or does it just happen? Like is that a consciously spiritual process for you?
um I don't know how spiritual it is. Like, I guess everything is spiritual in some way, but
Mm.
and I do think it is processing, and it is like a way of like um you know kind of analyzing a situation, or a way of writing. It's like a story almost,
Mm-hmm.
like um and sometimes it usually for me it happens very quickly with when you've got something in your heart, you've experienced something. Like one year I was at the 12th of July, which is like a kind of a public holiday in Northern Ireland, where yeah, there's parades, and um it's kind of like a contentious thing in our society, but
Yeah, it's a Protestant festival, really, I guess.
yeah. And I kind of came away from that day with a lot of heaviness, and a lot of like, you know, just like what I'd experienced, what I'd seen, what I'd witnessed going on. I really, it was heavy on my heart. And the way I expressed that was through a song called Don't Drag God Into the Mix. And
Mm-hmm.
I've played that song you know, like many, many times in little concerts and stuff. And it's always one of the songs that I can talk about and basically share some of these thoughts about peace, and and
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I think, like, I would say God has used the song to help develop conversations, and help people to think about these things.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me. I kind of re-listened to some of your music as I knew I was going to talk to you before this, and there's a lot of them that, I mean, some of the lyrics are really, I guess maybe when you're writing it, it doesn't seem that way, but from an outsider's perspective, like a lot of them are actually really um, vividly uh, provocative, is what the word I would say, or they have the
Mm-hmm.
potential to be controversial. Like for example, I remember hearing the one about Remembrance Day, for example, and saying like the cenotaph is like the golden bull that people are worshiping at, and I just thought like, wow, that's like a huge statement. And
Yeah.
have you ever had any backlash from, and whether I agree or disagree with what you're saying, I guess it's, you know, it's serving a purpose of helping people to see perhaps unhealthy practices, but do you ever get backlash from the kind of really vivid language that you would use?
Yes, I would say like, um, I would say most people have been really supportive, and like it's sort of something that's resonated with them. But I have had a few occasions where people have been provoked, or like it's been something they've really,
Mm-hmm.
really been upset about. I remember one time in Oma, there was an orange man who was quite upset about one of the songs because um,
So Orange Men, for example, they would be the kind of the main, the Orange Order would be the main Protestant kind of organization in Northern Ireland, and I guess an Orange Man would be one of the most staunch Protestants of the country. Would that be fair to say?
yeah, like they would sort of kind of be known for maybe not liking Catholics, and sort of some people might say that they would have like sectarian kind of views. Um, Although this orange man was very, very firm that the Orange Order is biblical, like it's
Mm.
based on the Bible,
And I
and
guess, like, I know
you
from
know,
people in my family being involved, like there's a lot of different people's different motivations involved. Like there's some people's motivations could be questioned, and then some I would say are, you know, some people might have really harmless views, or in a lot of ways, or maybe they're just
yeah,
proud of their expression of their faith. But yes, they would be seen as perhaps being a contentious kind of organization, or one that might, you know, some people would almost be afraid of, I guess, in some ways.
yeah, 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 and I would say like with the language and the vivid imagery, maybe of some of the songs, like I think also it's art, and art is expressive,
Mm-hmm.
like, and sometimes to say something, you have to like really say it.
Yeah.
It's like, um,
So what was this
and
particular Orange Man's point of view then on
well,
it?
I don't know exactly, but he kind of just said the Orange Order is based on the Bible, and you know, you should not say anything against it or anything, and
Mm-hmm.
he used different words and stuff, but
Yeah.
um, he just like, I think he was upset because maybe I had, one of the lines in the songs is talking about like how there's like maybe a bit of a darkness to the Orange Order, and
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, and just questioning the whole idea of you know triumphing, like as a Christian, trying to say that you know it's good that we triumphed in a military way, and that God is on our side, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I guess, like, I'm not necessarily going to condone or not condone your music, or necessarily like agree with it. I'm kind of trying to keep my cards close to my chest. Like, I would love to have an Orangeman on the show. Like, I would love to talk about like that expression of faith in a lot of people's minds.
Hmm.
But I guess, yeah, it definitely, I mean, at least the first few times I've heard some of your music, like, it was startling in a way to hear it put across in those terms. But I definitely, like, I agree that art is provocative for reasons. I guess for me, like, I'm still working through um the not that I don't understand the meaning, but I guess it's working in me through, or it would take time, or, you know, it's almost like been a process of evaluating the meaning behind the songs and how it's applicable. And I guess it's a
Hmm.
ministry in some ways, your music, but in a lot of ways, yeah, it's, I mean, I can see, I probably, like, a lot of those views wouldn't necessarily be the ones that I would choose to air, and whether I agree or disagree. And but I think there's definitely been, it's I can see how it could be helpful in terms of helping people to evaluate, like you said, toxic practices. Like, I mean, for example, there's the Remembrance Day to me is definitely a solemn moment, but I can also see how it provides a time for people to be overly nationalistic and maybe heavily pro-war and maybe too sort of triumphant about the kind of death toll that was inflicted in the past. And it's really, I mean, like the main thing I would say, or the main way music's hit me is like I can see the struggle within the music as you write it. Obviously, these are things that have touched you, and they're things that a lot of people will wrestle with. And like I said, whether I agree or disagree or would choose to write those terms, or whether I like just downright don't agree at all, I think having a forum for, like you said, like good provocation or like being provocative in a good way is definitely something that's needed more. And I like to hear the music of people who have different experiences and opinions to me, because then I get to sort of think, well, what could drive someone to be really passionate about this cause, you know, and why would they seek to share this with me, you know?
Yeah. And I like, if I look at Bob Dylan's material in the early 60s, like, you know, it was very provocative, you know, very much like before his time in a sense. Like, you know, some of the things like the songs that he wrote against the war in Vietnam, or, you know, songs he wrote about like black people who had been, you know, killed, like Emmett Till and, you know, Medgar Evers and Hurricane Reuben Carter. You know, he wrote a lot of songs that were like advocating for the oppressed, or for, you know, things that had happened in society. And I suppose I kind of see it in a similar way of, you know, things that have maybe touched my heart or moved me in a certain way, to kind of, because I think I've journeyed in that way. Like I've journeyed from, you know, like it's not like I've grown up having these views, but it's more something that I've had like a journey in, and kind of came to a bit of an understanding, or like a revelation almost of, oh wow, there's something really important that needs to be said here. And I want to say it, you know, I want to say it to whoever will listen.
Have
And
you ever been tempted to kind of like water down the imagery for the interesting thing? I mean, it's sort of a paradox in some ways of working in a center of reconciliation, but also using like quite brash language to your own community. So have you ever been tempted to water it down at all, or do you think that sort of cutting edge is really helpful in the process of healing in its own way?
yeah, I think I do have to be very careful with where I would, you know, play certain songs, or, you know, and I'm always quite careful with explaining them in like a loving way. And because I do think it's important to speak in love, you know. um and I think my kind of motivation would be that, you know, people are brought on a journey of healing and restoration. Because ultimately I don't think it's healthy to live in a society that where there is like sectarianism, and, you know, where like these kind of views exist. And I think that's my motivation, is to challenge, for people's own good, to challenge, you know, these worldviews. And because I do think, you know, um, we are, like, the world is on a journey, and like information is so easily accessible now, and more people are going to be aware of, you know, you know, our past, and, you know,
Yeah.
different views and different interpretations, different narratives.
That's going on at the
Whereas,
minute, I guess. The kind of views of, like we touched on earlier, the statues of the people in the past, and even I know the Prime Minister mentioned about paintings in the National Gallery of people who have been involved in shady stuff, but are perhaps in other ways where they have memory. And I guess this is the struggle of the more you dig, the more you find that you might not like. And it's a
yeah,
really big question in the future of in the age of information, and like even with people that you might like, even if there's a politician who you might really agree with, you could dig their Twitter account from 6 years ago or something and find something you probably would really disagree with, or might not be, you know, I guess you could say
yeah,
PC. And it's an interesting time for sure.
yeah, absolutely. And I I think the only person will never find dirt on is Jesus, you know, and
True.
he's really like he's our example, and he's
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the one thing that is the most important in all of this is actually we need to follow Jesus. And um, probably I one of that would be one thing that I would be very kind of adamant about is
Mm-hmm.
like let's lift up Jesus and worship him, follow him, not you know not King Billy or not like whoever, it's actually
Mm-hmm.
like laying our culture aside, laying our own traditions and um our pride and just leaving it at the cross and following Jesus.
Amen. Well, I think that's a really good note to end on, a good way to wrap it up. So, like I said earlier, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat today. Anyway, I know we've gone on for a while, but it's been great just to kind of, I guess, process with you and to learn more about your background. And I just appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. So, thanks
Yeah,
for that.
thanks for having me, Josh.